Hello, and welcome to Survey Magazine's webinar series. My name is Brian Fish, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. Today we are presenting a journey into the mind of a market research anthropologist. In a moment, we'll hear from Vice President of Morepace's Qualitative Research Group and expert anthropologist, Erica Ruyle. Today's event is brought to you by Survey Magazine and being broadcast by Research Radio. The sponsor for today's webcast is Morepace. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. Throughout the presentation, we encourage you to interact with our speaker by typing in questions and comments using the questions panel on the right side of your screen. We will be collecting your questions and comments during the presentation and conducting a Q&A right after today's presentation. If you'd like to join the conversation on Twitter, the hashtag is #SurveyWebinar. The Twitter name for today's guest is @Morepace. We'd love to have you connect with us in social media and keep the conversation going beyond today's event. Also, we are recording today's session and we'll make the link to the recording available within the next day or so by sending you an email where you can click a link to access the on-demand recording of the webinar. You will also be able to access the audio recording at researchradio.org shortly after today's presentation. So let's get right to it. When asked, what did you want to do when you grew up? She'd proudly reply, be just like Indiana Jones. She was fascinated with archaeology, history, past cultures, and literally uncovering the truth. She had her heart set on conducting historical archaeology in Japan. A perfect combination of her love for Japanese culture, history, and understanding cultural influences through time. Imagine her dismay as she got ready to head to graduate school to learn that foreign archaeologists weren't allowed in Japan. Times may have changed, but she couldn't wait. Not one to give up or be deterred, she moved to Japan after finishing her undergraduate degree to figure out what was next. It was there she realized that her love of uncovering the truth and passion for understanding cultural influences could be done anywhere, anytime, and on anything. Fast forward to today, and she has been using her anthropological background and ethnographic training to help uncover consumer insights for 8 years. Creative methodologies and innovation are constant drivers for her, and she has fostered a number of new methods by combining applied anthropology to the market research industry. She has been conducting ethnographic research in a variety of venues and on a myriad of topics for over 11 years and has learned the importance of truly understanding all influences impacting thoughts, feelings, and experiences that affect decisions and behavior. Bottom line, it's important for her to help clients see the world through their consumers' eyes as it allows for more effective product and service communication. Please welcome today's speaker, Erica Ruyle. Erica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who's joined today. So with that fantastic introduction, of course, we'll be talking about understanding anthropology and applied anthropology within market research. So we're going to go ahead and take a little foray into some of the parts of my mind today, and we're going to get started, and let's just kind of level set and talk about what we're going to be doing today and how it is that we look at anthropology, how we understand it. So I'm just going to start off just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what anthropology is. How is it that we can leverage anthropology within market research? One of the really important things is really gaining comfort in what we call gray space, broadening your toolkit, or as we like to call it, your bricolage. What is the nitty-gritty of ethnography? And then after we, have all of these different methods that we can conduct, how do we report that on the back end? Because everything is different. We take a cultural analytical approach to that, and we'll talk briefly about that. So for today, what is today? Today is really meant to be high level. It's got academics included with it. We're going to cover a lot of different things broadly. There's a number of topics in here that could be their very own webinar. But really, the point today is meant to get you thinking differently, looking at your research with fresh eyes, and understanding the importance of using an anthropological approach in market research, and really understanding how anthropology can fit within market research. And so what it's not is it's not meant to make you, of course, the ultimate anthropological authority. I wish I could do that within, 40 minutes or so, but alas, that won't happen today. I don't want to bore you with too much academics. Like I said, there will be some academics, but we won't cover everything. And we're not going to give specifics such as how we use the anthropological method in things like human-centered design, human-computer interaction. It's really, as I said, it's really to give you a different way of looking at your research plan, giving you the flexibility to understand that. And so let's take a trip into our first room here within my mind, and that is in helping us understand what is applied anthropology. So you may say to yourself, what is anthropology? Maybe you know what anthropology is. Let's talk about that. So in my world, anthropology is really the study of humans, past and present. It's really understanding the full sweep and complexity of cultures that are across all human history. So historically, anthropologists in the United States in particular are trained in 4 areas. I won't get into all of that, but it's really important to understand that we integrate the perspectives of several of different research areas, teachings, and professional lives. And applied or practicing anthropologists work in a number of different fields, and that could be within communities, within museums, but that can also be in businesses, retail, or of course, within market research. In anthropology, the thing to remember is that in anthropology, individuals are not considered in isolation from their social context. The symbolic meanings and practices are shared. They're not individual. This is in contrast to really a psychological approach that has been really held high in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, most marketing research used a psychological framework that was focused on mindsets, need states, and emotions. Anthropology is really understanding all of the cultural, social interactions that go into what it means to be human. And so the question then becomes, what does that mean for market research, and how do we understand it? What is it that we are looking for? And so I want to talk briefly about culture and what culture is. You could spend, as I said earlier, a whole nother session on understanding culture, but I just want to, again, level set in terms of what culture is when I talk about it. What do I mean by that? And so culture really, at its base core, is looking at patterns. And so that's a good thing to keep in mind. It's patterns of behavior, patterns of thought, and patterns of feeling. So remember, we're looking at this in groups of people. These things, behavior, thought, and feeling, they're learned, shared, and transmitted across generations. So they're learned over time. Culture is represented by both behavior as well as symbolic interactions. And, real quick, an example that I always give about culture in terms of the behavioral is shaking hands is a hand signal. Not every culture does that. In Japanese culture, they tend to bow the way that business cards are given out. That is all behavioral culture that is learned. How we eat, who we eat with, how do we view school, that is all behavioral as well as the symbolic in terms of, what's allowed, what hand signals you could use. If you think about the okay signal when you put your forefinger and thumb together, it means okay in the US, but in Brazil, it means it's the equivalent of giving the middle finger. These are all symbolic. The reason I mention this here briefly is just so that we understand that culture operates on many different levels. So understanding culture often is unspoken, and there are a ton of unspoken rules, and it is our job as anthropologists to uncover what those unspoken rules are. Culture is also very much multi-layered. A lot of times we like to think about culture as, Japan has a different culture than the US, than Europe has. But culture is very much multi-layered. in that when we think of culture, culture works under umbrellas and smaller units of subculture. Those are nested within those larger characteristics of units of culture. So you could have subcultures for people who like to play video games, or reading culture, or those who play sports. You can have sports culture. And so that's important to keep in mind, that we're not just talking American culture. We can be talking about everything that goes along with it. One of the most important things to look at is, of course, culture versus lifestyle. We in market research tend to really, when we get recruits, we're recruiting for a particular dynamic. We're recruiting for a particular individual or a particular lifestyle. We want them to have, X amount of income. And culture and lifestyle, they are similar in that lifestyle is a part of culture, but lifestyle is not in and of itself a culture. So what's important to keep in mind is that you have the umbrella of culture, which then trickles down into a lifestyle. And the role of a lifestyle is actually very unique to consumer culture. You have to have consumption to have a lifestyle in the way that we think of it. So when we think about culture versus lifestyle, they are very much, lifestyle comes from culture. So we don't want to discount culture, but lifestyle in and of itself is something unique that happens within consumptive culture. Now, the question may become, well, how does culture figure into the business world? What our clients are asking? We're often not aware of the role of culture in business. So we're often thinking about, wow, I'm going to do a project on office products, on staplers and business cards, and I just don't understand how culture fits into that. Culture is very invisible to us. And when we look at it, there's several things that happen. So the first is that as an anthropologist and within ethnography in general, we have developed a scientific way of doing things. And that goes even further into business in that we have developed a scientific way of doing business. There are very particular aspects of how we conduct business that lead into a larger understanding. And you can really see this when you move outside of your particular business unit. So regardless of what it is, whether you sell office products or sell cars, you have a very particular way of doing business. So if we're going to understand, for example, office products, there are very particular set of cultural rules that go into how business is conducted, and therefore how we would look at things like business cards. What do business cards mean? How about the different office products we purchase? And so there is that cultural aspect to it. It may not be at the forefront. It may not be something that is considered a major factor within the business world, but there are anthropologists whose jobs it is to go into the business world and conduct business anthropology. And so it becomes a huge factor. So if we take a step into the next room here, I want to talk about methods. So if you remember, I said up front, we're going to talk about broadening your toolkit, what those methods are, and really kind of diving down. Ethnography is the bread and butter of anthropology. And in some way, shape, or form, we do conduct ethnography and market research. When I first started out in market research, and I was so excited to bring ethnography, and I realized, what most market research individuals call ethnography is just really an in-home, which is an interview done on-site. It's not done in a facility. And while that is not to say it's wrong, your in-homes or other research that you're doing can certainly be much more rich. You can get a lot of deeper insights really by looking at parts of ethnography. So ethnography really is exploring, representing, and writing culture by studying people. So it's understanding the context of everyday life. It's done in a natural setting. You want to participate or understand participation in daily routines. Expose contradictions, so really understanding what is said versus what is actually done. those get to those surface hidden beliefs, as well as discover what really matters most. One of my favorite examples is I was doing a research project on video games, and I was in an individual's home. She had 3 kids. The youngest was probably around 5 or 6. And we were talking about video games in the basement where their center was. And I said, I noticed you have kids. Do you allow your children to play violent video games? And she instantly, oh, no, of course not. There is no way that absolutely not happening. And I'm like, okay. And we continued on our conversation. And as we continued on our conversation, about 15, 20 minutes later, I hear a really tiny voice from the top of the stairs. Mom, Mortal Kombat is broken. And she looked up, she's like, oh, okay, I'll be there in a little bit, just play something else. And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and there was just sort of this understanding that, 15 minutes earlier, she said she didn't let him play, and I looked at her, I go, Mortal Kombat, that's the fighting game, right? And she's like, yeah. I'm like, isn't that considered violent? And she kind of, yeah. And I said, could we take a step back and review that earlier conversation? We did, and we had an incredibly rich conversation about how violence isn't black and white, and she lets them play the violent video games if it's just gore, but if it has a sexual undercurrent to it, she doesn't allow it. And it was just so amazing. And that is not something that we can get in, a facility or in a lot of different contexts. The other important thing that I want to point out within ethnography is that we work in inductive reasoning. So we move from specific observations to broader generalizations and theories. So we're going in and looking at it. We're not going in and working like deductive, where you begin with your theory or topic, but rather this goes from specific observations, measurements, and then looking for those patterns and regularities. In that example that I gave you within the video games, it went from talking to individuals on a broad topic to really understanding violence in video games and what that meant to individuals, coming up with specific patterns of observation and thought. Within this, theory drives method and method drives theory, and I will talk about this, but it's important to remember that ethnography is holistic, it's comparative, and it's relativistic. And when we think about theory drives method and method drives theory, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we use a method called grounded theory, where we're building our theory from the ground up. And so this is much different in, for example, say academia, where you're starting with theories and going in to understand those. Now, within ethnography itself, there are a number of best practices to think of. And I'll just highlight some of these here. And, you may look at these and go, well, if you're in qualitative research, these are all aspects that you want to be or include, and that is true. A couple ones that I want to talk about is reciprocate. So if you're going in, give something back to them. So for example, I've done research on smartphone adoption and understanding that. And initially, when they were trying to learn the phones, my job was to watch and learn how they use it. And later on, I was then able to go back in after that initial sort of data sweep and say, look, here's some tips for using it. And that helps keep the dialogue open. It helps build the trust. I often talk about qualitative yoga. In ethnography, it's hot yoga, I guess you could say. You have to be very flexible on the fly and constantly moving. And we write our guides in ethnography, and we still look at those, but we need to be prepared to go down roads that we may not have thought we were going to go down. The other big thing that I want to point out here is being self-reflective. And so being able to recognize sort of your own thoughts, your own feelings, or as we call ethnocentrism, which is thinking that, one culture or one aspect is superior to another. And so within being self-reflective, it takes some time to get used to how you might be feeling on a particular day or with a particular project. And so understanding your own feelings is just as important, so that at the back end, when we do the analysis, we can take those out. And so, stand back, I think, is really important when it's appropriate without being, tempted to kind of jump in and join the interaction. So if you're working, for example, in a restaurant, you're doing ethnography, being able just to stand back and observe and listen actively and get all of those insights that you wouldn't otherwise get if you were constantly asking questions. When we do ethnography, for example, if we're in a retail location, I like to have them do what they do first without interrupting them. Just watch. Hey, pretend I'm just here along for the ride. And then go back and say, let's go back. I want to go back to this particular area and ask you these questions, because then you can get of a more natural nature in terms of what is happening. We recognize that we are going to kind of put the flow or mess up their flow when we're there, so we do everything that we can to minimize that. So the question, and I talked about this earlier, about the idea of consumption and lifestyles and crafting identities. And so a lot of people often ask me, how does the idea of consumption help us answer questions in market research? And really quickly, I just want to talk about this in that consumers craft unique identities through consumption. So there's a link between consuming and personhood. So this link tells us who we are, who we want to be, how we want others to see us, and how we see the world. So goods signal all of this. So the clothes that we wear, the food that we eat, the cars we drive, the clothes, anything that gets us from point A to point B is a signal of our personhood. And they provide a very powerful context for the marketing, selling, and designing of products. So if you think of the organic movement or the coffee and drinking pour-overs versus a coffee you get at 7-Eleven, those are all unique identifiers that we craft and project so that we can show the world who we are. And so what's important here is when we are conducting ethnography or any type of research is really understanding if there is a consumption component to it. They're buying a car, they're buying a fridge, even, buying, for example, household cleaning products. All of that says something about who they are, and we can kind of start climbing up the ladder to understand what in our culture kind of triggers those, and how then can we either get a different group of individuals, or how is it that we pull it back so we can, get either sell more product or move into another category. So when we look at ethnography, the very important question is, how does ethnography answer client questions or business issues in general? What is it that we are doing within ethnography to help understand this? So a few bullet points that I have up here. So we plan for the future by understanding how culture evolves. So culture is not static. Culture is constantly evolving and changing. And so really being understand and keeping 3 steps ahead of where culture is going. And a lot of times we get this through understanding outside particular subcultures. So for example, if we're looking at cars, it's really understanding what's evolving outside of cars that could potentially, have an impact on the future of cars in general. So it's understanding broadly what is happening within our culture in general that, believe it or not, has an impact within certain particular items that we may be looking at. We want to minimize the cultural risks and identify opportunities. So if anybody's old enough to remember Clear Pepsi, it's a great example of an innovative product that failed because it wasn't the right time. A lot of products come into market that are fantastic products, very innovative, great products, but it is the wrong time to present that opportunity. And within applied anthropology, we can help minimize that. It creates the most specific, relevant products tailored to highly specific consumer targets. So we can look at different segments and say this group is different than this group. And I'm going to talk in just a minute about our research participants and how we recruit those and who we should be recruiting. We can position products in a way that respond to what consumers desire most. So really understanding and exploring new markets, looking at different schemes, understanding the what, when, why, how value that gets linked to purchase decisions, and focus on problems and desires that consumers are most likely to act on. I don't talk about it here, but if anyone's interested, there's a whole consumer anthropology methodological way of thinking that describes sort of how desire works within consumers. Again, that could be a whole other topic in and of itself. In terms of positioning products, look at particular phenomenon in intimate settings. You can gain insight into unspoken rules and rituals, how they use the product, in which manner they use it, when and why. And then, of course, segmenting the market according to culture, going beyond just your normal demographics. So understanding consumption and identity, looking at shopping habits, looking at communities of consumption, and that's very specific to particular subcultures or particular lifestyles as well. So I had said early on that one of the goals of this and one of the things we would be talking about were data collection techniques, and what are some of the data collection techniques that you should consider. And so if nothing else that you take out of this today other than a broad understanding is maybe exploring more deeply some of these different data techniques that I'm going to introduce. We, of course, within anthropology and ethnography use typical qualitative techniques. We still do focus groups. We still do IDIs. But there's a few techniques that you may not have heard of that would really help bring your research to life. So the first one I want to talk about is key informants. And they can be and often are one of the most fundamental participants and parts of the research project in an ethnographic study. So this allows you to have a person that serves as a spokesperson for a group, but it is also somebody you can go back to kind of check the things that you're hearing. So you can go back and say, I'm hearing this is a pattern I'm seeing, what do you think? Or could you explain this to me? I saw somebody doing this, and it's very helpful. So you could have several that can speak to the scope of a project. So this could be anybody who's a retailer, a consumer, a specialist. You want to look for somebody who is highly introspective, they're reflective. Sometimes going to somebody who's marginalized is good. Somebody really relativistic, but they can help you understand some of these activities and areas that are most important to look at or clarify anything that you're seeing. Getting an oral history as a data technique is another really good thing to go in, and this is not simply a dialogue. So an oral history is the telling of a firsthand account from memory. And a good oral history, you create a rapport and you let them go. Oftentimes with oral history, you're not recording just the names, the dates, the places, but you're looking for anecdotes. You're looking for them to paint a portrait of lived experiences. This technique within market research carries some really broad implications for understanding changes in consumption patterns, such as brand and retail channel use over fairly long periods of time. So one of the big things with this is you can often go in and just ask a question and let them go and not interrupt. So for example, tell me about the history of car buying for you. Talk to me about your first car to today, and just let them go, and you can ask those questions later. And knowing where they start and where they go is as important as what they say. The other thing is an experience audit. So we often do in-homes where we're taking people into shopping centers or restaurants. This is really a holistic exploration of purchase geography or retail experience for a particular category. This can be done with or without research participants. So you could go in, for example, look at the layout. What's the placement? What's the shopper flow? Aspects of design that include sensory elements, navigational elements. What are staff interactions that are happening? What are that role definition? Looking at category management or in-store communication. Often experience audits are really powerful when you're looking, and you go in first as an anthropologist to study those physical, spatial, social, and emotional dimensions, and then add a consumer interaction on top of that to see how they interact with and understand it. Sorting exercises, these have been used for a long time, but they just help us and help our respondents put their thoughts in a particular way of thinking. Safari is one of my favorites, actually, and with a safari, you're not going out and talking necessarily to your everyday respondent. So, for example, if you are in the pet food market and you're trying to understand how individuals look at pet food, you would then go on what we call a safari. So you might all pile together in a car or have teams who are going, and you would go and talk to pet owners. You would go to talk to breeders and look at kennel facilities. Maybe you set up some time and talk to pet store owners or go look at various pet stores. What you're doing is you're spending time exploring all of the different aspects that go into sort of pet ownership instead of just going directly and talking to an owner. Mind mapping or mapping is another technique in understanding the environment in which the behavior takes place, so you can collect those relevant artifacts, map out the spaces. So this can include things like conceptual mapping, mind or language mapping, or even drawing and experience mapping. And these can be really powerful techniques to go into and use. The other one, of course, projection techniques. I think everybody's familiar with these, but these are very powerful techniques in uncovering those unconscious motives. And then the last one that I want to measure is trace measures. And this is collecting and recording traces of consumer behavior. So this is done without the consumer. It's really looking at, things like recorded visits, hits on websites, garbage analysis goes into this, fingerprints on packaging, or even understanding tears or empty packages. If you think about the power of asking individuals, and the University of Arizona did an experiment where they asked individuals, how much are you eating, what are you throwing away? They got self-reflective answers from everybody, and then went in and looked at their garbage to see what the truth actually was. And so this can be pretty powerful within market research as well if we really want to understand how somebody's using it and what they're doing. One of the things that's incredibly important within ethnography and anthropology is being multimodal, being able to take multiple methodologies and conducting those for one study. And so you may have a key informant, and you may go in and do an oral history, include some sorting exercises, some mapping. The point here is that we want to go beyond just a normal Q&A session and use a variety of different techniques to elicit the insights that we're looking for. So if nothing else, if you take nothing else about today away, take away the fact that using multi-methods is really going to yield some major insights for you. Now, I mentioned earlier about recruitment and about getting respondents and respondent types. So when we think about it, we think about this in kind of three different layers. So you have at the core, you have what we call our essence respondents. Those are the individuals who are extremely invested into their, whatever it is that they're looking for. They're the smallest segment, they're the most intensely involved, they're early adopters, they're trendsetters, they're evangelists of a particular category. Our mainstream is the majority of consumers that are not as intensely involved or committed to our essence. So they share some attitudinal and behavior characteristics of essence, but in general, these are the people we talk to most often. And then we have our fringe, and these are individuals who are not very involved in it. So if we look at this and we think of coffee, say we want to come up with a new coffee shop or new coffee store, we would want to recruit respondents in all three of these categories. So we want to get the individuals who are maybe coffee snobs, who could tell you what the difference between a Ethiopian and a Sumatra and a Colombia blend is, and why I want to pour over versus a drip. These are the individuals who really understand it. They are very involved in it. We can learn a lot of information from them. We can get a lot of psychological factors. We can get a lot of cultural characteristics or knowledge from them. Our fringe are not very involved. So maybe these are individuals who drink coffee on occasion. Maybe they're the ones that are stopping at gas stations and just grabbing whatever, because to them coffee is coffee is coffee. And those are our friends. They're not super involved. They really don't care. But we can often learn about about our target by learning who our target is not. And so we often want to just say, this is our target. We recruit to the mainstream. And if we're always recruiting to the mainstream, we're really missing huge chunks of understanding in terms of that particular kind of world of activity or world of goods. So sometimes it behooves us, and you could just maybe recruit, for example, say you're going to recruit 10 mainstream, maybe you just talk to 3 essence and 3 fringe. But getting their ideas and opinions is very, very powerful. So early on, I said that we would kind of talk about not only the methods of what we're doing, but how we analyze that, because the analysis of it is as important, if not more important, than the actual conducting of research itself. And that is because we take a very different sort of view at what it is that we have collected and how we get our insights. And so, what is really different about anthropological analysis? You may be asking yourself, how is this any different than how I go and, report later on an in-home or a focus group? And so the first thing I want to talk about is within ethnography itself is the way that we conduct ethnography is, I mentioned multi-mode earlier in terms of the research that we do, but we also want to have multi-methods of capturing. So when we go in, it's very important we capture video, we can capture audio, take pictures, take a lot of notes, just good old-fashioned notes. And these notes, when you take these notes within your field note system, you're not just taking responses, what people said, oh, that's a great quote for me to use later, but you want to really understand, their body language, where are they looking, what are they doing, and understand their environment, what's around them, what is their material culture like. So if you're in their home, what's the outside of the home look like? How about the inside? If you're focused in on the kitchen, where is placement in the kitchen? These are all really important things. By having a good field note system in place, in terms of taking pictures, capturing audio or video, you can get all of this information. The other thing I had mentioned earlier was about being reflective as a ethnographer and anthropologist. And a lot of times when I'm taking notes, I kind of draw a line, not quite middle, maybe give myself a quarter of the page. And on that quarter of the page, I'm writing down sort of my own thoughts, feelings, opinions. So I know at the very end, on my left-hand side of my notebook, I have actual observations and conversations. And on the right-hand side, I can then talk about sort of my initial feelings, maybe initial analysis or themes, or even, like, oh my gosh, this person has 2, 3, 4 cats and I'm allergic to cats. My eyes are getting puffy. I'm getting irritated. So I can look back and know, hey, maybe I was being a little, harsh or missed something, and I can go back and then check my audio or recordings of that. Within the analysis itself, so ethnographic content analysis is used to document and understand the communication of meaning. So we want to verify theoretical relationships. And when I say theoretical relationships, I'm not just talking about, relationships within families. I'm talking about relationships to objects, to items. We have relationships. If you remember when I talked about self-identity, we can have a theoretical relationship with our household cleaner or kitchen cleaner, how we use it, in what manner do we use it? Do we go in, spray it, and run out of the bathroom and wait 5 minutes because it smells so bad? What is that relationship like? And so it really requires, as I said, that reflective movement between the concept development. So what we want to do, once we have all of this great information, we've captured everything, we've done our research, you then look at the concept development between your sampling, your data collection, your data coding, your data analysis, and your interpretation. One thing that's really important is that we aim to be systematic. So we want to have a good coding system. We want to be able to go through our notes systematically and analytically, but we don't want to be rigid. So if you remember, I mentioned hot yoga earlier and being flexible. Even in our data analysis, we want to be flexible. The categories and variables that we get initially guide us. So we may come up with initial categories or initial ways for us to code the data, but it's really important and expected that others are going to emerge as we're doing the analysis. So one of the most powerful things about conducting ethnographic research is that we learn things we never expected to learn. So that is why when we are going in and doing the research, we're not filtering anything. We're not going in and saying, oh, that's not important. Everything is important because we don't know on the back end what is going to be important. We have constant discovery. There's constant comparisons relative to situation, setting, styles, different nuances, and then we conceptually code. So data is coded conceptually so that one item may actually be relevant for several different purposes. So we're not doing a one-to-one coding type of system. The other thing is when we look at the research method, we're really looking at what we call decontextualization to recontextualization. So decontextualization, we take the data out of context via a coding scheme, we take new data and categories, and then we recontextualize that and rearrange the code so that the data then tells a story. And so that's really important that we pull it out, look at it in that systematic and analytical way, and then pull it back for the story. Within, I won't go through all of this, but these are sort of the principles of cultural analysis. And what I just want to point out here is that, values are context dependent and that things are not always what they seem. So we want to make sure that we're going in, that we understand sort of those surface hidden behaviors, that everything comes from within a cultural construct. And if you're in the US, this is really important because individuality is an American construct. And so looking at the individual aspect becomes very cultural within, for example, American context. And other cultures have different sort of idiosyncrasies like that. I mentioned grounded theory. Within grounded theory, what we do, so I've talked about the data gathering, what we do with that. We code it, we look at our memos, we classify it. Then, once we start to do that, we can start to formulate a theory. So what is going on? What is it? What are those patterns telling us? And then finally, do a literature review. It's often really powerful, and it's a misstep. We're usually barreling down at 100 miles an hour on a 65-mile-an-hour stretch of road so we can get to the end report, and we don't have time to say, hey, what have others found on this topic? Sometimes this literature review can also come at the front end to educate yourself. And you would be amazed. Just go to Amazon if you have access to Amazon and type in anything anthropology, anthropology of cars, anthropology of sugar. It's been written about, and there are some great insights that can really help you understand your consumers or your particular research project. So just take some time out to be able to look at that. And then, lastly, really it's this contextual understanding of the underlying purchase and behavior. So again, traditionally, marketers were trying to get in the mind of the consumers to figure out the variables and criteria in terms of how consumers decide things, what they buy. So trying to get the messaging just right, the packaging just so, product formulation, grow markets, grow revenue. But really in anthropology, we're trying to identify consumer desires. So in terms of what's really at issue, not the aspirations, not something that's on trend, but what their desires are. Understanding what, when, and why values get linked to specific purchases. And then lastly, defining the positioning of values-driven brand or products within a well-defined consumer target. And so with that, let's move to our final room and just get some final sort of thoughts here, kind of wrap everything up. This has been a whirlwind tour of anthropology. I get that. As I said up front, there's so much that we can go over. But, my goal in today was to help you think differently. So if nothing else, there's just a few points that you can take with you or give to your colleagues. So as an anthropologist, stay on the move. We want to look at opportunities to observe patterns across time and space. So, get out of the facility, get out of the home, start moving, go around neighborhoods. So if you're doing an in-home, give yourself a half hour to walk the neighborhood. What's close by? What do the houses look like? What kind of cars? What kind of conversation? Keep your eyes open. So observe, observe, observe. Always be curious. And of course, if you weren't, you wouldn't be here listening to me today. Challenge your assumptions. Take a contrary viewpoint. Ask how you know what you know. And then ask questions. So don't ask why, ask how. And of course, just when you think that you've understood it, dig deeper. Keep going. Ask more. What's at stake? Engage multiple points of view. So all behaviors and attitudes have value. Don't discount something just because it's not in one of your research objective points. And then, of course, don't believe everything that people say. You have to meet them where they live. And so just this quote, the knowledgeable world is incomplete if seen from any one point of view, incoherent if seen from all points of view, and empty if seen from nowhere in particular. So what's really important is gathering multiple viewpoints, multiple thoughts, multiple locations and observations, and triangulating that data on the back end. So again, look through multiple lenses. Try to understand it from multiple points of view. Don't just go for your mainstream respondent. Look at the fringe, look at the core, or look outside of that. Another really important thing that I cannot emphasize enough is get outside the house. So not only am I imploring you to get outside the facility, but if you're going to do an in-home, get outside the in-home. Get out and look at what's around them. That doesn't necessarily mean that they need to take you anywhere or you need to take them, but really understanding all of that sort of culture and geographical space around them as well. Culture is at the heart of who we are and the heart of what we do. So having an understanding, even a small understanding of the cultural influences and those larger patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behavior is incredibly important. The other thing, and I like to kind of wrap up with this, is that a lot of times we talk about, the big N versus the little n, because within ethnography, of course, we're not going out and interviewing thousands of people. We might do 8 or 10 or 12, but really understanding that we are getting incredibly rich data from these individuals is more important than having thousands of numbers. If you've done qualitative research, at some point you hit a saturation. You're hearing the same things, and that you are starting to see and look for those patterns of behavior. And so lastly, I talked about this earlier, but multimode. Do multiple methods. Don't just go in with a discussion guide, ask questions, really kind of think outside the box in terms of methodology. Can I get better information by mind mapping, or, asking them to personify, or just even letting them talk? It can be very, very powerful to go in and have multiple methods at your disposal. And so with that was indeed a whirlwind tour of Into the Mind of a Market Research Anthropologist. Very passionate. I have a ton to say about it, but I'm hoping, like I said, that you walk away and you have a fresh take, a different way of looking at your research that you're doing. And so with that, thank you very much for listening to me today. We have some time left, and are there any questions?
Nice job, Erica. We do have a few questions that have come in.
Perfect.
And I'm going to start here. Let me put my glasses on. I'm a little older than I thought. Sorry. Question number 1 is, since anthropology is so focused on culture, which typically requires spending a long time in that culture, how do we get at quote-unquote culture in qualitative research when we are here with people for such a short period of time?
No, that's a great question. And yes, traditionally, ethnography and anthropological work happens, you move to the Congo and you live with the natives for a year. And unfortunately, we can't do that. What's important is relying on our expertise or relying on vertical expertise. So if you have somebody who's been doing cars for a long time, they may or may not realize that they already have a ton of knowledge. And that's where doing things like your literature review or reading up on it ahead of time is also really important. And so that is why you would do something like rely on a key informant who can help guide you, tell you an understanding of that particular culture. And so it's as much work as we can do. And within industries, if you're constantly, hey, this is, Joe's been doing cars for 20 years, and he becomes his own sort of cultural expert within that and can help understand.
Excellent. Okay, question number 2. How can non-anthropologists conduct ethnographic work to the same degree you discussed today?
Yeah, one of the things is viewing the ethnography as an opportunity to go in and just capture everything. And so, we tend to think we have a discussion guide. I'm going to ask these questions, and then I'm going to, just analyze it on the back end. One of the things, again, to keep in mind is that multimodal method, but to look at everything around you. So if you're going in and you're talking to individuals, it's really capturing a ton of data. When I go into the field, I come out with hundreds of pictures, 2 or 3 notebooks, and I'm not talking that I'm spending more than 2 hours with each respondent, but I'm making sure that I understand all of the context around them. So it's capturing more than you think. So you always keep your research questions in the back of your mind, but you want to just capture everything. Everything is fair game because you don't know until you sit down to start looking at the patterns across all of the research that you've done, what's important. And we can't be afraid when we get out of the field to end up with more research than we ever know what to do with. I could probably write tomes of just, research and how people act that didn't even come into play in terms of the research question, but I don't know that until the back end. So being very, very open and collecting enough data so that you can then do that decontextualization of the data. It also requires on the back end a little bit different thinking than we're used to in terms of breaking apart everything that we've seen and putting it back together to tell the story. We're not just grabbing quotes and putting those in. We want to be able to get a large variety of information that we may or may not use.
Thank you, Erica. Number 3. What does your ideal ethnographic research project look like?
If I could design the ultimate ethnographic research project. So, one of the things is that typically, of course, we're almost always determined by budget and time. And so within market research, I think even within budget and time is to allow the ethnographer or the anthropologist that you're hiring to do their work. And what I mean by that is, let's say we'll go back to the pet example, and you want to understand, how to sell pet products to dog people. So you would have your respondents, but instead of saying, okay, in 3 days we're going to talk to 9 or 12 respondents, in 2 weeks, we want you to talk to, 12 respondents, but we also want you to understand the market. And so within that time, what you essentially would happen is that the ethnographer has the research and they go conduct anthropological and ethnographic research. So that might include time. They might go to pet stores, spend time in those pet stores watching people shop, watching how they interact. Of course, they'll go talk, in their home, they'll have a guide. But being able to go scout around, really gather information and data from a participant observation standpoint. So it's not just we're going to do 12 people and be done, but you're really understanding sort of the world of pets and dogs and pet food. And so that would include a lot of different stages that your ethnographer would conduct, not necessarily with clients, not necessarily with research participants, but you've given them 2 weeks, for example, to go in and do ethnography within a time frame to collect all of that stuff to have very insightful findings on the back end.
Excellent. Okay, I have a couple more here for you.
Sure.
At the end, you talk about the essence, mainstream, and fringe way of looking at recruiting. Essence is obviously the gold standard, the core audience you are trying to get to, but how do you find this consumer without breaking the bank?
Sure. So mainstream is actually really what we're going for, right? Those are our mainstream users, and our essence is our evangelists and our early adopters. And so a lot of times, honestly, these individuals want to talk because they are so embedded in the category itself that they will talk for not a ton of money. And a lot of times this can be done by snowball sampling. Keep in mind that our essence is a really tight-knit group of individuals. So they're going to know people who know people, so to speak. And so a lot of times you can talk to people in their space. You can go into them and talk to them. So for example, if you're looking at a coffee, in the coffee example, and you go and talk to baristas, they're usually more than happy to talk to you about that particular topic because it becomes such a love for them. They want to share that information. So when we look at individuals, remember, mainstream is our typical market. Those are the people that we typically recruit and will most likely be using our particular product. Our essence, our evangelists, and then our fringe are those who are not involved in the category.
Okay, next question. So how do you capture 2 to 3 books and hundreds of pictures in a 2-hour in-home while still maintaining eye contact and rapport with a respondent?
So that is a great question. So when I am in the in-home, I've learned to be able to write without looking. My mind actually I know that they say there's no such thing as multitasking, but when I am talking to a respondent, I am writing while maintaining eye contact. It's something that has taken years of practice and may not be for everybody. The other thing is I always build time into the research project itself. So in the in-home, I build in time so I have time for that show me kind of context, so that I'm going to go and take pictures. So show me your fridge or show me your garage. The other thing is to really rely on your research project team. So, we're not ever going into this alone. We are going in with individuals who are helping us. So we have somebody who is doing videography for us. If we have somebody who's helping us take notes, or taking pictures as well. But when we go in, that 2 hours of time is not even necessarily spent all just with the Q&A. As I said, a lot of times it's spent, okay, let's talk about this, now show me, or demonstrate this for me. So as they're demonstrating, a lot of times we'll take pictures, or a project team takes pictures as well.
Okay, I have one more for you.
Okay.
How do cultural stereotypes play into the conclusions that the market researcher ends up making?
Yes. So I mentioned it in passing, but didn't kind of expand on it. So there's this concept of ethnocentrism, where we start to think about one culture being another or having those stereotypes. When you go through and you're looking at all of your different respondents, it's really important to leave any preconceptions at the door. So we like to go in with, hypothesis. So we have our deductive reasoning and we have our hypothesis. But what's really important in ethnography and anthropology is throwing that all away. So when you walk into a house and you talk to respondents, you've thrown it out the door. And on the back end, when we're analyzing the data, I know that a lot of times we like to, what's the difference between our millennials and our Gen Xers or our baby boomers? When we're doing the overall analysis, unless we're getting into the specifics of segments, I'm not looking at who said what. I'm not going to look initially at where that information is coming from. They're people that use the product. And then once there's this broad understanding, we can start to narrow in specifically into understanding a particular category or group of people. So it just really requires us, as I said, to be reflective and to throw that ethnocentric way of thinking out. So we don't want those preconceived notions. We're kind of tabula rasa when we go in and start recording our observations. That's another reason you want to keep your notes divided, because if you're writing down your observations and thoughts that maybe play to a stereotype, you'll know that on the back end as well.
Okay. Could you expand on wrong time theory, i.e. clear Pepsi, Crystal Pepsi failed because it was introduced at the wrong time?
Yeah, so there are a number of failed products. There's a great book about it, and the author's name at this point in time escapes me. Sometimes products are just introduced too early to the market, or they're introduced, they're introduced at not the most inopportune time. So another example is you don't see it very much anymore, but brick coffee. If anybody remembers, you could buy the vacuum sealed brick coffee. I believe it was Planters with roasted nuts introduced brick Planters roasted nuts, and they were peanuts that came in a vacuum brick seal. And because this was introduced at the same time that vacuum seal brick coffee was coming in, consumers were really confused. They were actually taking it and trying to brew it. They weren't reading it. They weren't looking at really what it was. Now, if we introduce that today, that might actually be a good selling item in terms of we understand what vacuum sealing even is now and why we may or may not want it, what those advantages are. So sometimes it's introducing something too early to a market where consumers just aren't quite ready, or that they're used to a different type of innovation and they're used to something being very different. In the case of Clear Pepsi, for example, since I mentioned that, if Clear Pepsi was introduced today, I don't know, maybe it goes over well because now we have a movement that we want things that have less additives. They're more organic. They're good things for us. So saying here's Pepsi and it doesn't have any additive color because of everything that we know about additives and color, it might be a good selling item now, but at the time it was introduced, people didn't care about those things.
Okay, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Erica. This does conclude our presentation for today. I want to thank you all for joining us. You will be receiving an email that will alert you to the on-demand status of today's event within the next 24 hours. On behalf of our guest, Erica Ruyle, as well as the entire team at MorePace and Survey Magazine, my name is Brian Fish, and we wish you a great afternoon. Thank you so much for attending our presentation today.